Great, like a grown-up. Don't be an adult, it's a trap. Oh, hey. We are, in fact, live. Hello, good morning, panelists.
Good morning.
Good morning to you out there in the QuaranCon audience. I am so thrilled to see everyone here. My name is Amanda Cherry, and I will be your guide through this 1 hour walk through love and other stuff. And we'll get into the other stuff later. First, I got to get into the technical stuff. If you have questions for any of our panelists or all of our panelists as we are having this discussion, please pop them into the YouTube chat in text. Our amazing technician will then port them over to us through the magic of technology. And I will make sure that we get to those in the order they come in when we get to the Q&A session at the end of the panel. Also, I want to remind you that there is programming going on all weekend here at QuaranCon 2022 for all of us that are once again staying the F home. In conjunction with that programming, we have a book sale going on, and we have many of, especially our indie authors that are participating in panels this weekend, have books in that book sale. Everything is either free or 99 cents, and it is an amazing way to find some work by new authors and maybe find a new favorite. So I absolutely encourage everyone in the audience to go and check that out. Not now, though. Now you want to listen to us, but later you want to go and do that. I also need to remind everyone, although I don't think I need to, but I am required to remind everyone that we do have a code of conduct here at QuaranCon. No cruelty, no slurs, no being naughty. If you are too naughty, we do have a technician in the chat with the ban hammer of justice. We will just say goodbye to you silently and never acknowledge your naughty, trolly behavior. So let's not do that, okay? Because I hate that. It's no fun. It ruins it for everybody. Other than that, I do want, this is a love panel. It is not a romance panel, but we will get into concepts of erotic love. And so I say we're probably PG-13 or a soft R. If that kind of content squicks or upsets you, then be ready to mute us for a minute when we segue into those topics. I do promise to announce them well before we start talking about them, especially anything having to do with consent and erotic love. So if those are sensitive topics for you, I am aware that can be a thing, and I will make sure you are adequately forewarned so as to shut the conversation down for a minute and then come back, because we will not be on any one topic for too long. Now that I've been talking for a full 2 minutes, I would like to let some other people talk right now. I have got amazing panelists here who write across sci-fi, fantasy, and romance genres, and I want to hear from them. So panelists, one at a time when I call on you, pretty please tell us your name, where you are coming from, and a short thing about what you write. I'm going to start with Dan because that is where my screen tells me to.
Hi, I'm Dan Fitzgerald, coming to you from finally sunny Washington, D.C. I write adult fantasy, usually romantic, and sometimes sword-free.
Excellent. Karen, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I am Karen Diem. I am coming to you live from the East Coast of the US, as far as you know. And I write superhero urban fantasy for people who like their heroes to be, you know, heroic, hopeful, hapless, and perhaps occasionally a bit lovingly tongue-in-cheek.
Okay, see, I'm going to have to go read that now. Stephanie, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I grew up in America, as you can tell by my accent, but I'm coming to you from Wales, where I've lived for the last 20 years. And I write both books for kids, which aren't particularly relevant to this panel, and I write wildly romantic, alternate historical fantasy novels, mostly set around the UK, but a couple in different parts of the world as well.
Lucy, how about you?
Hello, so I'm Lucy McLaren. I'm coming to you from my car in Essex, England. So apologies if you see many cars going past. I'm sorry about that. And I write young adult fantasy, probably towards the dark fantasy end of things, because I tend to be a bit grim in my worldview, and that just comes across in my writing, unfortunately. Or not unfortunately, I enjoy it.
Sarina?
I'm Sarina Dahlan. I live in San Diego. It's really hot here today. I write speculative fiction. My first debut novel, Reset, first of a series, is set in a futuristic world where memories are erased in the name of peace. So that's kind of my thread.
Ooh, that sounds fantastic. And I am Amanda Cherry. I am coming to you from the weather weird Seattle, Washington, the other Washington. And I write contemporary and historical urban fantasy, tabletop role play games, the occasional screenplay, and anything else that strikes my fancy because I cannot stay on task. But I will stay on task here for the next hour while we talk about love and other stuff. So we're going to start with love. In Western modern society in particular, there is a big focus on romantic love and erotic love as ways to drive a story. But there are also other forms of love that are equally valid. I would like the panel to speak at first to familial love and brotherly love and platonic love as drivers of story. So I want to start with Stephanie, because you said you write kids' books that are not necessarily relevant to the conversation. And I would argue that they are, that the relationships, the loving relationships within Kidlit is a perfectly valid representation of love in stories. So how do you
And they're
feel
good
about—
books too.
Oh, thank you.
Hey, about non-romantic, non-erotic love as a driver of characters?
Well, I love that way of framing it, because actually, when I first started publishing adult novels after publishing children's novels first, I was trying to think of how I could sort of frame my writing in general for my website as, okay, these books may not look like these books, but this is what they have in common. And one of the main themes in every single one of my books is familial love. And it is families, and that's true in both the children's books and the adult books. And, you know, one of my most recent books, The Raven Heir for Children, which is published by Bloomsbury, the whole book is really about the concept of what makes a family. And it's centered around these three kids who are desperately trying to save the rest of their family while also trying to figure out what family really means, with all these external adults coming to them saying, one of you is the heir to the crown, some of you may not be real family. What does family mean? And that's held true as a really important driver in my adult books also, because actually in my series, the Harwood Spell book, I tried to write the first novella, having had sort of the opening idea of the magic and the world. And what finally got me into the heart of the story was actually not the romantic relationship, although it is a romance, but it's the relationship between the heroine and her sister-in-law, who's also her best friend. And that platonic love is what really powers and grounds the heroine through being strong enough to overcome her issues, overcome her recent trauma, and actually be able to find romantic love again in a way that she wouldn't have been able to.
I love that. Anyone else have examples of like familial love and platonic love driving a story that you find particularly moving, touching, exciting?
I love writing about best friends because I feel like oftentimes, you know, there's romantic love gets this idea of love at first sight, but I think that can also happen with friends. You can meet someone and that first moment you're like, I want to be your friend. I think that, you know, we're going to like each other. So I tend to put that kind of relationship, though it's not generally the central relationship. I like to have that as a secondary relationship, because I think often that relationship itself can be the catalyst for the protagonist to move that person forward, especially if, you know, they have some kind of hangups or whatever. Their best friend can have traits that are so different from them, and they can find that to be a driving force, you know.
Anyone else?
I don't have a specific example, I don't think, although what has just flashed into my mind is Frodo and Sam in Lord of the Rings as, like, you know, a key platonic relationship that really is key to the story, really. But I just kind of felt like, or I feel as though it's very important that these platonic relationships are explored in stories alongside or even above romantic relationships, as a way of showing that actually you don't have to be in a romance to be able to, where if it's a fantasy story, you don't have to be in a romance to meet your destiny or whatever it is, if you know what I mean. It's just platonic relationships are really not as much as importance is put in them, but they are so important. That's just, and I think that Frodo and Sam is a massive example, but I'm sure there are many others, but my mind has gone blank. But I just think it's really important to explore them as well as romantic ones. And in my book, I have a brother and sister, and that's kind of a big part of the story, like their relationship. And I have the found family trope as well, which is a big one in fantasy, and I think a lot of people are fond of, and kind of maybe don't get spoken about as much as the romance elements of stories. But to me, I feel like family is a really important element to explore.
Absolutely. One of mine, I mean, I'm wearing my Wesley Crusher sweater today. I've really started, since having my son, actually really appreciating the parent-child relationship and those kind of loving relationships on the page. Also, Virginia McLean, who is one of our organizers here at QuaranCon, I'm on a panel with her on Sunday, wrote an amazing fantasy, came out this year, called Cyro's Claw. And like, there is a mom and she's having to schlep her little baby along with her in like this sword and sorcery fantasy. And she's going to rescue her romantic partner. In the meantime, she's got to deal with a toddler.
I really love that as a mom.
It's moms in fantasy. Like, that's a whole other, I think there's a panel on that this weekend. Because it's
like having a toddler isn't hard enough.
Right. And now I have to save the world. Gosh darn it. As we talk about familial love and platonic love, best friends, found family, that love can be powerful, but it can also grow toxic. I want to spend a minute speaking to toxic relationships as foundation, that does to a character as they move forward toward the potential of romantic love and erotic love. I did not write down who told me to touch on this topic, but one of you did. That was Lucy. So I'm gonna start with you.
Yeah, it's like a toxic relationship is very much explored in my book, and it's one that I feel like could be mislabeled as a romantic relationship, because I've seen that in a lot of popular stories, especially in the YA category, which to me is quite concerning. Because they are very popular, and I think they are misconstrued as healthy relationships when they're really, really not. They're actually, abusive, or there's gaslighting or manipulation or whatever you want to call it. So in my story, I wanted to make sure that I kind of make it clear as the story goes on that actually this is not okay, what is happening in this relationship. And it's, for that character, it's a big part of his arc is realizing that the relationship is toxic, and kind of exploring what that means for him and what that means for the relationship, because I don't think that toxic relationships are necessarily bound to fail. I think that if people can change and if there can be self-awareness within them that's explored, then that's a way of both partners working through it. But I think too much we see, there's no change, or there's this idea that, oh, I love this person and therefore I can fix them, and so this relationship is going to succeed regardless of this toxic element. I think that's seen way too much in popular stories personally. So I wanted to be realistic in what is a toxic relationship, what does it mean, what does it look like, and how does it feel to be in one.
Karen, I'm going to call on you because we haven't heard from you much. What are some of your thoughts on characters in sci-fi and fantasy moving through and possibly out of and on from toxic love relationships into healthy relationships?
I actually spend my second book dealing with a best friend situation, which isn't toxic, but there's a lot of boundary issues. And it's a pretty major subplot in book 2. because I have my main character is a very physical person. She doesn't hold still. You know, she's on the go. She's got to be doing something every minute of the day. Oh my gosh, let's do it now. And one of her two best friends throughout the series is a quiet Wiccan research librarian. And they have obviously a lot of things that are very different between the two of them. And that's one of the things that they start to have some issues with it in the first book. And then in the second book, they have to actually deal with them. And it is at the point of where if they don't deal with them, that will be the end of this relationship. Because it's not a toxic relationship, but it is one where they do have to take the steps to make sure that it doesn't either become toxic or end. So I do think it is important to show what's a healthy relationship. It is important to show, you know what, this is great, but using your superpowers that way on me is wrong. You know, and I hate to be serious, but sometimes you just gotta. But yeah, that was one of the things I wanted to work out, because one of the things I miss seeing in a lot of books and television and all that is platonic relationships where people are actually setting boundaries and they're dealing with ups and downs, this like you would have ups and downs in a romantic relationship, because there are those times when you argue with your besties. They're not always going to be able to walk into your apartment at 6 a.m., wake you up, go through your fridge, and not have you be like, you know what, not today, okay? At least once in a while. Because I mean, it's far too often it's either effortlessness or it's just not covered at all. So I wanted to make sure that got hit on a bit there, and
sure.
You know, also wanted to show a platonic relationship with heterosexual men and women that had and will have, sorry if this is a spoiler, no romantic relationship ever.
Yay. Friendship is magic. Friendship is valid. Yeah. Absolutely. Dan, I am going to call on you now because I know you put romantic elements into most of your stories as a writer of adult sci-fi and fantasy. How do you use other forms of love, be it healthy or toxic, to inform your characters' readiness to accept romantic love in your stories, and how they deal with issues within those romantic relationships?
As I said in the chat, toxicity is not really in my wheelhouse, but a lot of times I'll have characters, close friends, going on journeys. That seems to be the theme in many of my books. And along the way, you know, they get into arguments and they might get in each other's face a little bit when one of them's being a little bit difficult or unreasonable. But it's that willingness to get in your friend's face and say, you know what, that's not okay. That sort of helps them progress. And I have one character in particular in the Mare cycle who went through something that caused him to be rather, I know we're not supposed to swear, that caused him to be.
Oh, you can swear. It's okay. We're PG-13.
A rather unpleasant individual. And one of his friends had to, you know, several of his friends had to basically intervene and say, you know, this, you can't be like this. And it was their assistance that helped him to move forward to a place where, when he gets toward the end of the story, he was ready for a romantic relationship when it came up. And I really think that what Karen and Lucy were saying earlier is important. It's that there can be arguments and, you know, potential toxicity, but when you show people working together through that, to me, that's extremely valuable, and that's what I want to see more of. I hate big blow-ups, but if they do happen, you know, I want to see people knuckle down and do the hard work of getting back together, whether it be friendship or romantic.
In sci-fi and fantasy in particular, there often is an element of romantic love as a story beat. In both of my books, all three, like now that I'm working on another one, the romance plot is like the B plot, but there is a love interest, and that is there partially driving the story. I want to know from any of you who care to speak up, how you put romantic love on the page in a way that is not necessarily erotic love. We will get into the erotic stuff later. We will get into sexy times later in the panel. But as far as just those stirring of romantic feelings, particularly those of you who write YA, where there's probably not going to be spice on the page, how do you gently insert romantic love into your character's world? And I'm going to start with Stephanie because she's already unmuted and she's like, let me talk.
I was so ready. Well, actually, this is a really crucial question for me, because while as a reader, I love reading all across the romance spectrum, as a writer, I've decided to keep the same writing name for my middle grade and my adult books. And that means I have to be a little bit careful, because there's always the chance of someone picking up the wrong age group. I would say it's fine if you're an adult, please read my kids' books. That's great. But if you're a kid, you know, it could be more problematic picking up one of the adult ones. And so I've had to be very careful not to ever get too explicit. None of my books particularly explore erotic love at all, although there's stuff that happens off the page. So it's all about building the actual emotional connection, which is what we get to see on the page. And that's all about finding this kind of kinship of spirit, because when it comes down to it, a really happy recipe for life partnership, at least, you know, in my opinion, is friendship. It's actually that you are attracted to this person, but also you just really enjoy talking to each other. There's something about the other person's way of seeing the world that meshes with yours and adds something fantastic. And that's the fun part for me of writing these romantic fantasies, is watching someone find someone who just fits them and clicks so well, you know, which I've been lucky in my experience that was my experience in meeting my husband. But so that's where I'm coming from with it.
Next up, you can just unmute. All right, Lucy.
A big example that comes to mind for me of really good romantic love, but definitely not erotic in any way, is Lyra and Will from His Dark Materials, because they are children. But they get this, I'm sorry if this is spoilers for anyone, but the books are like 20 odd years old, so I'm sorry, you have to read them. But they're very young, but they develop, they're friends first, but they develop this really, I don't want to use the word pure because that has weird connotations, but this romantic love, they fall in love, and because they're like 13, 14, obviously there's no erotic element to that, but I really, for me, it was an amazing, it is really convincing love that they had on the page, and like a very heartbreaking ending that I won't spoil the ending, but it just, the way that it was described without any of those erotic elements is still very much convinced me that there was this real love between those two characters, and it's kind of stayed with me since I read it 20 odd years ago. That's the first kind of example that came to mind for me.
Looking around there, you Dan.
Yeah, I like this question. I have a relationship in my Weird Water Confluence duology that starts just as a sort of friendship or kind of a partnership or whatever, but over time it develops. So there's this kind of mind share, it's a mystical mind share thing going on, and during the course of the mind share, one of the characters discovers the other one has feelings for them, but it's not really the same thing as they feel, and they grow into a kind of a relationship over the course of two books that is not sexual in nature. It does have a romantic element, but it's a very slow grow. So enjoying that, getting to know each other, and the closeness, especially the closeness that comes with sharing minds in different ways. And they end up having a strong bond. And it was very interesting to explore that, because I often have explored sort of traditional romantic relationships, but this one is a little bit different. And it was, not only was it a challenge, it was also very interesting. I talked to a lot of people who had been in similar relationships. It's kind of like a allo ace pairing, and I I learned a lot in the process of writing it, and I hope that it came out well, because I'm used to writing more sort of sexual romantic relationships, and this one was very different.
I appreciate that. I was hoping someone would touch on the fact that we can write asexual characters or even sex repulsed characters who can still be in deep and fulfilling and genuine romantic relationships. The same as we will touch on later, we can have aromantic people who can still be in very satisfying sexual relationships also on the page. Anybody else wanting to speak to romantic love without erotic love before we open the floodgates to the spicy pages? Okay, no. All right, we're gonna get spicy now. Rivals or like low-key enemies to lovers is one of my favorite tropes to find, especially in sci-fi fantasy. I don't always love it as an A plot. Like I just want to read a romance. I might not want to go there necessarily. But when there is a lot of other stuff going on and we've got two characters who are, for whatever reason, like this emotionally, and then it turns into like that relationally, I love that. Can't get enough of it. And for me, that is one of those places where erotic love takes point, where it might be that specific brand of care and attraction that brings them together rather than the sweetness of romantic love. So I would like anyone to just unmute and start talking about stories and story elements where you have found that leading with the erotic love is working and is the way to get into the character's heart as opposed to romantic love or familial love. I know somebody wants to talk about it. There, Karen, hi.
Hey, this is sort of a bit of both.
Okay.
My main character, Zeta, she is acting as a vigilante, which means, masks and secret identities and stuff like that. And she does have a love interest. And right away, like I said, she's a physical person. She's like, okay, she's assessed him. He's a threat, but dang, he's hot. Okay, now we're gonna fight now. Okay, let's ignore the fact that he's super hot and just fight. So there was that awareness at the front, but because this other person is perhaps also masked, and there is a question that runs through a few books on which I may or may not have resolved at this point, 6 books in and working on 7. Where his final allegiances actually are. They've been forced to go very slow because trust issues. Neither one of them is the sort who's going to feel happy having a fun romp, shall we say, with someone who, if they knew their secret identity, could completely wreck their life and or kill them. So like I said, it's sort of a bit of both because they're kind of easing into the romantic relationship. And there is that element of we'd really like to do more, but we have trust issues.
Oh, that's yeah. I am so like about to go buy your whole series.
Yeah, there's a lot of it's a very slow burn on that relationship, and part of that is my main character has stuff to learn. She has to do a certain amount of maturing before she's ready for a romantic relationship. She has to go through book 2 of learning how to resolve things with the best friend before she can get anywhere near a relationship with this complicated person in later books that is ongoing.
Nice. I'm working on a story right now with Eric Scott DeBee, and basically a character I created and a character he created we were laughing one day and being like, oh my gosh, if we got these two in the same room, they would either kill each other or bang each other. And we're like, so yeah, that's a book now. And it's the Lady Vengeance comes into Ruby's office to be like, you broke the heart of this really special guy that I still have feelings for. And she's like, yeah, I did do that, didn't I? Want to bang? And that's pretty much the whole book. And they do catch feelings by the end, but neither one of them is in any sort of emotional, like everybody in this book needs therapy. Everybody, and nobody's getting it. So there's a lot of really good sex and not a whole lot of really good communication, but they do sort of eventually get there. We are hoping for a 2023 release date for that book, so hang on to your hats, it's going to be hot. Anyone else want to speak to places where the erotic love leads the way into whatever else? I see Sarina is ready to share here.
Yeah, actually my main character in Reset, because her memories are erased every 4 years, she doesn't really believe in love, because she's like, what's the point of falling in love if I'm going to lose, this person in 4 years? So she just goes on these random first dates. She only does first dates. She thinks second dates are just a waste of time. And on one of those dates, she met Benja, and they had chemistry right away because they really got each other. But they ended up deciding that they were better as friends, and they ended up being best friends, and their relationship turned platonic. So yeah, so that was a really fun couple to write, because you can absolutely be attracted to someone at first meeting based purely on the physical, but if you're not there to have in the headspace to have a romantic relationship, it doesn't really matter. But the fact that they actually enjoy each other and found something that they needed in each other, and Benja ended up being a catalyst for Eris, so that she was able to later on get into a romantic relationship with another person.
That is precious and wholesome, and I love it very much. How very enlightened of you to like have these characters who are so self-aware. That's rare and that's fabulous. Anybody else want to speak to this question before I go to the next one? All right, this is actually, yeah, Lucy, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think both Sarina and Karen touched on this, in that I'm a mental health professional. I work with teenagers and children. I think it's really important that in stories that you've written, that trauma is explored as a reason why people behave in certain ways in both romantic and erotic connections with other people. Trauma can be a massive informant in terms of how people think, feel, behave, all these things. So yeah, just wanted to kind of say that I feel like it's a really important thing to explore.
Yes, definitely. And that also helps me segue. Stephanie, yes?
I'm sorry, you were just about to segue.
I can always segue, please.
Well, I just wanted to leap in here and say that as a reader, someone whose work I love in that enemies to lovers dynamic is Tasha Suri. She is so good at it in Empire of Sand, and then again in the Jasmine Throne in different ways. You get couples who start out on very different sides, and it seems pretty impossible for them to actually have a healthy, happy relationship. And I still don't know whether they will in the Jasmine Throne, because that's only the first book in a trilogy. But in Empire of Sand, they do in the end, and it's beautiful. And I love Jasmine Throne. So that was my bit.
Yes, yes, yes. So the thing I want to touch on next, because we are not just talking about relationships in stories, we're talking about relationships in sci-fi and fantasy stories, where we have speculative elements to deal with that maybe your like run-of-the-mill contemporary or historical writer doesn't. Particularly things like people getting their memory erased every 4 years, particularly people with superpowers. How do we, as authors of speculative fiction, work on things like boundaries and consent and power dynamics? Karen, I'm going to call on you first. If you've got a character with a superpower in a romantic/erotic relationship with a character who doesn't have a superpower, how do you balance the interpersonal and relational power to make sure that there is clear and informed and enthusiastic ongoing consent in your scenes?
The love interest may or may not have superpowers, but they're considerably more subtle.
Okay.
superpowers. He my main character, she totally has superpowers. She is a teleporting shapeshifter. So and she's like hyper. So she is just like all over the place. Great fun. But her love interest is a mercenary, and he is a very physically, if she did not have superpowers, he would probably be more than a match for her, simply because of the strength and height difference. And the fact that, he's a mercenary and she was an accountant slash capoeira person slash climber slash whatever other hustle she can come up with to keep the electric on one more month in her apartment. So he has the experience, he has the skill, and that sort of thing. And he is smart enough. I mean, that's not exactly the right word, but he's smart enough to where even if she were using her superpowers, she would have to work at it. He would be a threat because he is able to use tools and all that experience and everything else. So I kind of equalized their power somewhat. She is part of the thing that holds their relationship in the state it's in is the fact that she is very well aware that if she picks wrong and if he is not trustworthy, that will not only possibly kill her, but it could kill her family and her team, which is her best friends and all these other connections that she's made. If her secret identity comes out and he's not trustworthy, so there's a lot of that as well. She doesn't know exactly what his connections are, but she's a good guy. So she's never going to be that kind of threat to him. She knows it. He knows it. Other supervillains are like, well, you could catch me or you could save that person I just put in peril so that I can get away. So I try to balance the power on it, and make them not uneven. They both have a say in where things go, and they're both just as likely to go no. And the other one's like, okay.
Anyone else with somebody with magic, somebody with power? There we go, Dan.
Yeah, in the relationship I was mentioning earlier, and that's in Living Waters, there's one character who has meditation magic, so she's a practitioner of this practice, and the other one does not. And so she has to do a kind of a mind meld with her to help her heal from this disease. It's complicated, but anyway, I work the scene very much because it's a very intimate connection. So I work the scene in terms of consent and everything else, just as I would a sex scene. So like you have to ask consent for every stage of the mind meld process. Like I'm going to ask you to open your mind to me now. We're gonna touch foreheads now. And it was I think fantasy and science fiction give you this extra space for something it goes a little bit beyond what you can do with romance or love in a non-speculative world. And it's really interesting to explore because I think there's a whole side of the mind and the being that is very deep, but that's not necessarily purely romantic. So I explore that space, and eventually over the course of 2 books, the other character does develop some of this practice. But I do think that consent and not just in sex, but also in relationships and touching and all sorts of aspects is important. And SFF definitely has some different aspects to consent.
Next, Lucy.
So yeah, I think a big part of the consent aspect should be kind of acknowledging the don't know if you'd call it a trope or whatever it may be in I don't know if it's fantasy in particular or if it is FFF, like this idea that for a female character gets sexually assaulted and then that like is the moment where she kind of finds herself and like becomes who she's meant to be and all this kind of stuff. I think that's a big issue in certainly older stories. Yeah. So I kind of in my book wanted to flip that on its head a bit, in that there is a sexual assault, but it's actually really messed up, this character, and she's very traumatized by it, and her life is impacted by what happened to her, and there's no way that she found herself. She has to deal with the thoughts and feelings and kind of anxiety and a lot of mental health issues around what happened. But that kind of plays into this idea of rape culture is a big thing. It's a big thing in our society, and I think to an extent it is important to acknowledge that it happens, and it happens in real life, and that a lot of the time when there's a blurry line with consent, like I feel like it's only recently that consent has become something that's spoken about openly, and there's a real issue with believing victims of sexual assault within society. And for me, I kind of come from a place where the stories that I read, I want to see real issues explored, even though it's a fantasy world. I enjoy those realistic representations of our society. So some people want to escape. I feel like I connect more with those kind of issues being explored in the stories.
Sarina, want to speak to consent and power dynamics?
Sure. In my book, though, the consent part didn't have anything to do with the physical aspect of a relationship, just because, it's a progressive society, a speculative society where people just, have sex when they want to and or not, but where consent was really that I felt was important to address in the book had to do with memories, because some people are able to remember and some people cannot. And when you can remember and you remember someone as your ex-lover and they had already moved on to another relationship, some characters would force themselves on this relationship. It's like, you and I had a relationship before, and therefore now you should be in love with me again. And that is an important aspect that I wanted to kind of address in there, because the two main characters, one, Metis, could remember, Eris could not. And at one point, he actually wanted to use this drug that would stimulate her dreams so that she could remember him and their past lives. But he had a mentor, a woman, who actually said, no, you cannot do that, because choice is very important. You're already having your memories taken away. That is already enough. You should not, it's if you were to force the memory on someone, it's just as bad as removing someone's memory.
I like that. This book I was just telling you about a few minutes ago, that these two rivals to lovers situation happens. One of my characters is just a really unbelievably powerful sorceress, and a lot of that is new power, but the one power she's had her whole life is that if she tells you to do something, you don't have a choice. She can convince a person of anything. So something that I was really careful to put in the first time these two hook up, the other character is like, tell me what you want me to do. And she's like, no, you have to say it first so that it was your idea. Because if I say I want you to do X, Y, and Z to me, and I accidentally mean it too well, then you're not going to have a choice, and we will never know if this was fully consensual. So you have to say it first. You tell me what you want me to do to you, and we're good. But me saying it out loud, especially first, is going to taint this encounter forever. I see Karen has her mic unmuted.
I do have one of the best friends characters. She engages in a relationship, and the person in the relationship is at a lower power level. The other person, basically, they're immune to electricity. the best friend is a telepathic witch. So if she wanted to, she could, nudge things to be where she wants them to be. And that was actually part of the book 2 thing that they were working through, is the boundaries on how she's using her powers. But she's in this relationship with this person, and this person, despite being lower, at one point goes, you know what, I can't do this dating a superhero thing. It's not for me. You're great, but your lifestyle does not work for me. We're over, we're done. And the best friend accepted it and was like not happy, but she also didn't even try to convince her otherwise, or use her powers deliberately either, just to make sure that, she wasn't pushing things the direction she wanted it to go, just because her girlfriend no longer wanted to be with her.
Yes, that is. I really love all the healthy communication that this panel writes. Like, I am very impressed with all of you. To take this one tiny step darker, I'm going to call on Lucy first, so be ready. There are things in modern Western society, particularly you spoke about trauma and toxicity earlier, things that can be mistaken for love by the person feeling and doing them. Things like obsession, things like lust, things like stalking, things like forcing yourself on a partner. When you are reading sci-fi and fantasy, at what point and at what level do you need it acknowledged in the text, or at least by the character on the receiving end, that this is not love? This is not what I see as love. This is something ugly.
For me, I feel like it's how the story ends that's important, and where those characters end up. And I think too often in popular stories that we've seen, they end up together, and there's nothing has changed in the relationship. It's still a toxic relationship and there's still abuse happening, but they've kind of done that thing of, oh, because we love each other so much, everything's fine and we're going to be happily ever after. Whereas I think actually what an example of a character whose arc I felt was really good, well done with the trauma aspect, and there's sexual assault involved, was Captain Kennett in Robin Hobb's Live Ship Traders trilogy. If anyone's read that, he's a character. He's very much an antagonist. He's not a good person, but there's a lot of these elements kind of she explores as the story goes on, why he behaves how he does, and it's not a happy ending, but for me that's kind of like the payoff. I don't necessarily like seeing happy endings if that's not a good payoff for how the relationship has been, if that makes sense. There has to be some kind of awareness, I think, from the author, not necessarily from the characters, that actually these characters should not be together, or they should not be labeled as having a healthy relationship if there are very clear red flags.
We met when he kidnapped and tortured me, but we have a connection. It's disturbing, because as I said earlier, I work with teenagers, and too many times I've had mentioned to me like certain films or book series, and they're like, I love this, and I'm like, that's great, but the relationship in that is really not great, and there's so many elements of abuse and manipulation and all this kind of stuff. I think for me it's important that authors like ourselves are aware of what is a realistic representation of a toxic relationship and how we're putting that across in our work. Like there's no issue with including these relationships in our works, because they happen, but
are we representing them as something else? Are we representing them as this is what a relationship should look like, rather than actually, no, this is really unhealthy.
Anyone else care to speak to that which is not love, but is sometimes mistaken for love? Karen?
Well, you all knew I had opinions. Yeah, one of the things, I think Lucy's right. They need to acknowledge, these things are not a healthy relationship. It's not just the real obvious ones where he's kidnapped and tortured me and now we're in love. There's also the more subtle ones, like there is a series I won't name that's very long running, where the heroine is constantly belittled by her love interest, and he basically treats her as this immature child. And and she's cool with it. And she's like, no, he just loves me that much. And I didn't finish reading the series.
I'm going to make you tell me what it is backstage after the panel. I need to know what this is so I don't pick it up.
It's a cozy series, but and it's not the only offender. I've seen this a number of times, but it's a little more subtle form where it's just like, if one of you is acting like a parent in a relationship, that is super creepy, people. Come on.
Right, that's not sexy. That's not hot.
That is not sexy. That is not cool. I don't care how good he looks in his pants. If he's like, you can't make good decisions, I always have to rescue you. Well, one, your author needs to let you rescue yourself more. But two, that's not love. That's not a healthy relationship. That's not something that people should be modeling relationships after. And I've seen girls who are like, oh, well, I do this and it's wrong. It's like, no, honey, you're doing you.
If it is love at all, it certainly isn't the kind of love that makes for healthy romantic partnerships. Yes, again, if someone is a parent in the relationship and someone is a child in the relationship, then that is not a romantic partnership. That it may be love, it may be tenderness, it may be caring, but do not conflate the two because that's gross.
Absolutely. If at some point he decides you've done wrong and he gives you a spanking and it's not a consensual happy times one.
Correct.
That
Stephanie,
is a relationship you should be running, screaming out the door and possibly getting a restraining order.
Indeed. Stephanie, what did you want to say to this?
I just wanted to say that really, even outside the fantasy and science fiction field. So I read a lot of romance blogs, and one of the most common reasons why a romance without, in the actual genre would get a bad review is if the reviewer doesn't believe in the happy ending, because you have to, in order to be satisfied by any romance, you have to believe these people will actually be happy together. And I've seen many bad reviews where people say, look, I want the heroine to be happy, but I think they need therapy. And I don't think that this didn't leave me with good feelings about that they'll be together tomorrow or next week.
So, right. The happy for now is a really limited time offer. I mean, it's happy for right now, but like 45
tomorrow it's going to be done.
You're in trouble. Yeah, that's a problem. Sarina?
I was just going to say that I find this discussion so interesting because I look at relationship as the best ones for me to write are the complicated ones where it's not black and white, where it's not this simple, this person abused me, but I still love him. I don't find that, it happens, but I don't find that interesting to write as an author. I just finished a book about a long marriage gone wrong. And sometimes and often it can happen where you begin the relationship and it's beautiful and it's loving and it's supportive and things happen, both of you or one of you can discover something or something out of your control, outside of your control. The world can change and then you change with it. And therefore it can happen where a loving relationship turns toxic. And oftentimes people don't even know that they're in a toxic relationship that started out as a loving relationship. And, I think that exploration is also just as important to kind of tell people that sometimes those lines are very, very blurry and decisions are very, very difficult to make because it isn't just a black and white situation.
Indeed, indeed. All right. Well, we are running out of time. I told you all this would be fun and fast. Before we go, I do want to give everyone the opportunity to tell our audience at home and our audience that'll be streaming this, rewatching it later, where to find you online and where to find your books. So we're going to go in like reverse order from earlier. Sarina, where can we find you online? Plug something.
I am on Sarina Dahlan, the way my name is spelled.com. I'm also on Twitter, Sarina Dahlan, and on Instagram as Sarina.Dahlan.
Excellent. Lucy.
I'll mute myself first. So main place to find me is probably Twitter, and then you can link everywhere else from there. And it's at Lucy A. McLaren, no spaces or anything like that. You can link to my website from Twitter.
Excellent. Stephanie, where do we find you online?
I'm at stephanieburgess.com, and that's Burgess IS, not ESS. And also on Twitter at Stephanie Burgess and Instagram at Stephanie Burgess in Wales.
Cute. Karen.
My stuff can be found at www.QuaranCon2022.com, and all my social media links pretty much off of there. I also hang out a lot at the superhero-fiction Discord if you're a Discord person.
Excellent. Dan, where can we find you and your books?
I am Dan Fitzwrights on Twitter, Instagram, vaguely on TikTok, at danfitzwrights.com. But if you want to find me, I'm pretty much, if I'm awake, I'm on Twitter. And books can be found through my link tree there. And I do have some spice and some not spice. So no spice and all the spice if you want some.
I like the code, like the cool tones versus the hot spicy. Yes, the green pepper versus the habanero. Excellent. I love that. And once again, I'm Amanda Cherry. I'm online at thegingervillain.com. My Twitter and TikTok, which is where I spend most of my day when I should be writing, are at Manda the Ginger. And I'll be on the Swearing in Sci-Fi Fantasy panel on Sunday afternoon. So afternoon here. We're around the world. It could be any time of the day. We were talking earlier. There are people that like, it's happy hour. I'm like, it's breakfast time. So I am so glad you all were here with us today. Thank you very much for tuning in, no matter where.
Mimosas are the answer.
Yes, mimosas are indeed the answer. And you have just given me a very good idea. Draft drunk, edit sober, folks. And I am drafting today. So again, I thank you all for tuning in to QuaranCon. Remember to check out the book sale. Check out some of our authors here are going to have readings over the course of the weekend. Be sure to have a look at the YouTube page. Look at all the archived panels and things that you may have missed because you were in fact asleep. And enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda.
Bye.
Thank you.
Toodles.